Now we're privileged to look at the chaplain. In this topic, there are 6 modules: training and qualifications, service opportunities, relationships, intervention, ministry to the grieving, and your equipment and identification. I've provided you a comparison between what a pastor generally does and a chaplain, and how they might blend but also might be different. We're not going to take the time to go over those in detail. You can look at that slide. There's also another slide on chaplain functions, their roles, the fact that we've already stated the chaplain is the minister in the middle of tensions. He is the liaison, that bridge, that go-between. Adventist chaplains open doors for the church to work inside of institutions and organizations that sometimes are relatively untouched by the denomination. We can go into circles that, unless you have status as a chaplain, are not as easily entered. We can engage in some outreach process by planting and nurturing and reaping. And we do possess special gifts through training that is offered for utilization by churches and conferences. So we earn the church credibility and hopefully a positive public image from their ministry and reputation. Chaplaincies, as we stressed, know who you are, know your job, be professionally competent, and do relational ministry, representing Christ to others and treating them as you would like to be treated. There's a picture here that is dear to my heart called the old circuit rider chaplain of the far west back in the late 19th century, where the chaplain rode from military post to military post in the Old West. It's just a visual portrait of what you do in more modern times as a chaplain, where you may be going from place to place in your community providing a ministry of presence. Chaplains symbolically represent God's presence. They do it by showing up, physically being there, reaching out, emotionally there, connecting spiritually there, and linking up electronically there. Because being present is usually more important than speaking or doing. Presence is involvement. It's an act of respect. It's caring that often prompts positive responses. In fact, when I'm called out to attend to a death in the community, and I'm visiting with that family, there's usually quite a bit of coming and going of friends, neighbors, and other people and relatives that pop in during that time. Sometimes I just sit kind of back off here to the side and I'm there. I don't have to be talking and engaging in conversation with everybody. But it's amazing the number of times that the people say, "Oh, chaplain, how wonderful it was for you. You just made everything seem right," etc. Well, you know, it's not what we do or say even many times. But the fact that you're there, you can't fix the problem, but you're there, you're showing in essence the presence of God for those people. I work at a major airport. It is in reality a small town of 20,000 workers. That's a significant number of people. And many of them are legal immigrants. Let's be honest, few workers or passengers attend chapel services. On Sunday morning when I conduct a Protestant Christian service, anywhere from 2 or 3 to 20 show up. We have a multi-faith shared chapel, loaned space by the Metropolitan Airport Authority. And we're viewed as contractors, not MWA employees. And so it is a relational, one-on-one ministry where we pray for personal requests. And by the way, I've had many Muslims who work at the airport and Sikhs who are there from many different countries say, Chaplain, can you pray for me? And they're very specific about a son or daughter or a marriage or some illness. When you establish rapport and people see you as a chaplain, being genuine in your interest for them, they will come and ask you to pray for them. And then you resolve personal crisis. I won't take the time to tell the whole story, but we dealt with a man without a country. And I finally had to get him food and a place to stay and get him in touch with his original homeland to work out some kind of legality around a visa. We pass out scripture cards. I like to leave something with the people when I'm out walking the terminals and visiting with them, and one of them is a little simple card like this. It's got a scripture on it, maybe a little saying from a Christian writer or another scripture on the other side. And I hand that card to them as I'm concluding my visit and say, let me leave a thought for the day with you. I have seen these cards stuck in their ID badges. I have seen them by the cash registers and the various vendors. And I have people asking me, please bless that card for me, Chaplain. And they also expect it every time I come around now. They're getting a collection of these. And that's wonderful when you know that it means that much to them. And so a simple little thing like a scripture phrase, thought for the day. We have a literature rack in our chapel, and we can put our Adventist materials there, and they are used, especially Steps to Christ. We've had 4 deaths among employees and 1 passenger since I've been there in the last 5 years. And we're part of a family assistance support team for crisis response. And thank goodness, we've only had to do drills. We're not having an actual crisis or emergency. Security is one of the biggest concerns. And so every chaplain is badged. You must have this displayed at all times because it is your access into places that passengers usually can't even go, and not all employees. And in mine, I have the ability to escort people who don't have badges. And so we can bring in guests to chapel and to other places on the airport. You wear this at all times. Security is a big concern. And then we have an annual plane poll that is open to the public. And the workers and volunteers all get together and they try to tow, in a kind of a tug-of-war, one of those huge jets down the runway for a short period of time. That jet, by the way, weighs many, many tons. I marvel every time one takes off at the science of aerodynamics. It's a wonderful sight, and what a world in which we live. When we come to the police, I work with a department that is nationally accredited. It's an agency of 800 officers and members. And our chaplains must meet the same standards as clergy desiring to serve as military chaplains. And so we too are supported by the department with a gold shield, a protective vest, and other equipment as needed. We are not permitted to train with, to bear, or use firearms. However, that does vary from various departments to other departments. What are some of the things a police chaplain would do in support of departmental personnel? Well, one, we make station visits and attendance at roll calls. prior to a shift going out on patrol. The guys really like it when Bev, one of our female chaplains, brings in her famous blueberry muffins. Well, I don't do that. I provide them with some other means and other things that they enjoy. We do ride-alongs with officers on patrol. That's 10 hours in a car with an officer. But you know what? At the end of that time, when you're invited to ride again with that same person, you know that you've had a good evening. You're on call from communications for crisis in the community. And that on-call period in our department lasts for a week. And then it's rotated. I teach out at the County Safety Academy for trainees. We have 2 classes a year, each lasting 6 months. And that's great exposure to these young trainees. We do funerals, memorials, promotions, family events. One of my favorite is Shop with Cops just before Christmas. The county identifies needy children. They are met at Walmart by the police officers and linked up with an officer. Santa Claus usually comes in on a helicopter, and the kids go through the store picking out gifts for family, friends, even themselves. It's okay. And they have a specific dollar limit. Last year, $175 per child that had been raised by the Brotherhood of Police Officers for this special occasion. The items are checked out and all put in a bag. And then while the kids are taken off for a special breakfast with the officer, others of us are wrapping these gifts and putting it back in the bag. And then the officer takes them home with their gift. Oh, what a magnificent time. And it's so much fun to watch these youngsters, many of them who would not have much of a Christmas otherwise. You pray at special events, at awards, at the policeman ball, and so forth. The police have a demanding, stressful job where they encounter sometimes long periods of boredom, of minimal events. I've been 10 hours and only had 2 service calls. But at other times, you're just going from call to call to call. Burnout does occur, and I've given you a chart here of symptoms of burnout, physical, emotional, and mental. I'll let you digest that at your convenience later. We attended an event in Loudoun County here recently with Dr. John Walker. He is a PhD, the psychologist for the Loudoun County Public Schools in Virginia, and he talked about caregivers and first responders and compassion fatigue. People who must deal repeatedly with people who are dead, hurt, neglected, or traumatized. And something sets in, and it can happen to you as a chaplain. It's called compassion fatigue. This prolonged exposure to the negatives of life, the traumatic responses, the hurt, the crises, can begin to impact on you, Mr. Chaplain. And you have to be aware of that. When you begin to think like this, that I have had too much to absorb, a sponge effect, or you wake up and say, oh, it's time to go on duty and serve the ungrateful again. You have a begrudging attitude. Or, what's the point? Am I making any difference at all anymore? When you're beginning to think like that, compassion fatigue has set in. And so Dr. Walker gave this large group, almost 200 officers and child protective service workers and many others, strategies for prevention and recovery, and I've shared those with you. Another element that occurred in training is what happens if an officer or somebody has to do the right act for the right reasons. And even though warranted and unavoidable, it is in violation of your core moral beliefs, your conscience. An example, an officer in self-defense or to protect an innocent life has to shoot a threat. This results in what is called moral injury. It's difficult. And I've listened to 2 officers who have had to shoot somebody. And in fact, both of those officers were also shot in the process. Have to deal with the depression, the guilt, remorse, and despair that set in, the withdrawal, how they were treated by others in the community. And one of the things you do is you listen compassionately and non-judgmentally. The solution? One of our Adventist Navy chaplains wrote a little book about this, and he says we have to reconstruct the person's moral compass and help them understand about grace and forgiveness by self, by others, and by God. I could spend an hour or two, or a whole session on moral injury, but we'll move on to resiliency. I hope that we're skimming topics, and I hope that what it's doing is raise the awareness in you for further study and investigation on these kind of topics. Resiliency, the need, the ability to remain calm during a crisis or chaos, to endure privation and overcome challenges, to bounce back strong and wiser from trauma, adversity, or hardship. Being unafraid is not resilience. Courage is doing your duty in spite of being afraid. And resilience surmounts fear. It comes really from good training. You can go on the web. I've suggested several sites and places where you can do some free self-tests on resiliency. The bottom line is this: take care of yourself, because there's not a long line of qualified persons waiting to replace you if you can't function in your role as a chaplain. And so it pays you to invest a little time to talk to some others about issues that you may have. On the next slide, I ask some questions that is important for you to ponder and answer. Which has priority, for example, achieving institutional goals or achieving harmony among workers? Is serving more important than position or status? Well, you can read those and only you can answer them. And so I leave that with you to ponder and pray about and to talk over with your spouse, with others who may be important. One of the ways you can help with answering those questions I mentioned is through life coaching. It's one of the secrets for a satisfying chaplaincy ministry: picking a mentor and staying in touch, being accountable to someone you trust. And then it helps to share by being a mentor to others. There are some lessons that I've learned over the years. I am not an expert. I've only done this community chaplaincy for 5 years, but there aren't many of us. And let me just share a couple of lessons learned. Be who you are. Weave some relationships into your work and play. And I would say that praying more reduces time fixing problems. Never underestimate your influence. You may think that, what good have I done today? I was just out riding with an officer, or I was just there at the airport walking through the terminals and talking with people. But you never know the response that comes back to you in weeks or even months later. And so you proactively seek ways to enhance spiritual values and fitness. Be creative in the ways you share the Adventist advantage. Well, I've given some handouts for you on this, what I call the 4 C's. Chaplains have moral authority based on their credibility, that is, their integrity, being honest with people, and the rapport formed with members of the agency, with the organization, with the leadership that they serve. Remember, chaplains, like pastors, are valued as long as they uphold the spiritual and organizational values. When you retire, when you leave a chaplaincy or a church for that matter, your functional service ends and you no longer have position or status. When I left the Pentagon and the General Conference building, the next day I had to be escorted to return inside with a visitor badge. That's not bad. That's just the way things are. You only have opportunity to serve the prescribed duties for a defined period. So make the most of every day, of every duty, because life rarely gives second chances. And the organization owes you nothing for your service. It was a privilege entrusted to you by the Lord, who blessed you for that purpose. Move on and enjoy the memories. Here's the bottom line for those of you who are looking at community chaplaincy. After 5+ years of volunteering in community events, praying often in public places and for public things, for my organization working, my chaplain work has not resulted in a single baptism into the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And sometimes I feel like a failure as a minister. If your purpose in community chaplaincy work is church growth, then please re-examine the 4 M's: mission, methods, means, and messenger. Often the problem is with the latter. Something became convoluted. So don't be discouraged. John 4:2 says Jesus never baptized anyone, and he was rejected by his hometown synagogue twice. I like this quote from the book Education. Many a worker sends out into the world messages of strength and hope and courage, words that carry blessing to hearts in every land. But of the results he, toiling in loneliness and obscurity, knows little. So gifts are bestowed, burdens are borne, labor is done. Men sow the seed from which, above their graves, others reap blessed harvests. They plant trees that others may eat the fruit. They are content here to know that they have set in motion agencies for good. In the hereafter, the action and reaction of all these will be seen. If I didn't have that promise, sometimes I wonder, because I don't often see those tangible results by which we measure success in our church very apparent. You are not the Messiah. Most of the disciples and the early Christians mentioned in the New Testament are relatively unknown and died in obscurity. You must do your best and remain faithful. Whether your name ever gets mentioned in denominational papers really doesn't matter. I like Revelation 14, verse 13. Blessed are those who die in the Lord, yea, their works may follow them. They leave a legacy. That's what chaplaincy in the community is all about. Reaching out to people, meeting their needs, winning their confidence. And then as the opportunity is given, saying, why don't you follow Jesus? Chaplaincy does require training. There are opportunities where you can serve without it, but I want you to imagine for a moment with me. You're boarding a commercial airliner, but the pilot only possesses a private pilot's license to fly a single-engine prop plane. You're going for surgery in a hospital, but the surgeon has been trained by first aid instructors and he's only passed the basic first aid course. Think about that. Now let's apply that to chaplaincy and to the church. What if our church ordained every member as a pastor who can perform church ordinances at will? Or the denomination lets any member speak officially and represent it to the general public? It just simply wouldn't work. It is only in the disciplines of theology and religion that many people feel they already know enough to be a spiritual leader without any formal education or professional training. When I was at the General Conference as the director of Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries, we had an individual who was extremely talented and gifted as a brain surgeon, but they wanted to be a chaplain, but they had never taken but 1 or 2 courses in religion in college many, many years previously. They're not ready for chaplains. It's a different requirement. And so what does it mean to become a chaplain in the Seventh-day Adventist Church? I know in years past there when we would come and present seminars and training classes for the various divisions, that the standards seem very, very high. And let's just give a basic requirement for chaplaincy. First of all, it's church membership in regular standing. And to be an Adventist minister, to be called into the ministry in regular standing. To have the ability to perform the ordinances of the church. Because you're going to be asked, perhaps, conduct a baptism, even for non-members. To lead a communion service for on Sunday morning, for a collective Protestant Christian service. To bury, to marry. We like to have some people as chaplains who have had pastoral experience, who have had experience knowing what it means to be in charge of a church and a congregation, and who possess ministerial credentials of some kind. You must meet the standards of the agency for which you are applying and you wish to serve. And then lastly, you need some kind of ecclesiastical endorsement. Now for community chaplaincy, it may be different than that of being in the military or a prison, a government agency. Maybe all that is required might be a completed application where you are granted a vote of confidence and a letter of endorsement by the ACM committee in the division, or maybe even by your local conference. Why bother? Because endorsement validates you as a pastor who has certain capabilities, professional competencies, and caring skills. It connects you with a church and certifies certain special abilities. It builds a network within the church and opens doors for future opportunity. And it provides the possibility of continuous service as a chaplain in the public arena. And more importantly, I have been asked on a number of occasions to show my credentials to prove that I am indeed an ordained minister. You can't conduct a wedding, for instance, at least here in the States, without some kind of clerical privilege. There's a long application process that varies from division to division. I'm not going to go through that. You can see it on a slide that we give. Be assured that you, as a chaplain, are not leaving the ministry. Community chaplaincy is simply an additional expression. You may remain as your pastor in the church and be doing this volunteer part-time. You might be a hospital chaplain full-time and spending a couple hours a week or a day, a month or two, doing community-type chaplaincies. But you need to sustain and retain your relationship with ACM, with your conference, with your church. That's important. There's a need for special training. I would encourage that you get as much experience in courses in administration and management, but particularly counseling, marriage and family, crisis intervention, and assistance to persons in stress and trauma. Be aware of ethics, because we're in a situation in our world today where morality and ethical situations are very gray. 50 shades of it is the common term today. And then, of course, learn a little thing and all you can about leadership skills. I would strongly recommend that every pastor, but for certain every chaplain, at least have one unit of what is called clinical pastoral education, CPE. It's absolutely vital. And then join a professional organization such as the International Conference for Police Chaplains, or whatever organization would be available to you. There are several that deal with the airports. There are some that deal with business and so forth. And there are lots of free online training courses that are abundantly offered. Chaplains are just another method of ministry among many. It's an equal alternate expression. Not every pastor should be a chaplain. We have one Adventist ministry. All chaplains are first and foremost pastors. But not every pastor is called to be a chaplain, and chaplaincy is not an escape from pastoral type work. We are on par with other ministers in this church. Same credentials, not different ones. Let's look at some of the opportunities for service that you can have as a chaplain. In the community, we've raised some questions. What opportunities are available for chaplains locally? Are there local officials and leaders open to Adventist serving? Will the conference support a pastor getting involved in community agency activities? For example, as a part-time volunteer. Will vacation time or days off be counted against days you're serving in chaplaincy work? What special training is required and who pays for it? Does the chaplain wear a uniform, and how is it obtained? What duties are expected to be performed, and how many hours or days are expected to be on the job or on call? And if risk is involved, is the chaplain covered by any kind of insurance in case of injury or death? If you're going to be a chaplain for first responders, remember that your primary duty is to serve the men and women who repeatedly face danger, death, injury, loss, and lots of negative public reactions. Chaplains must affirm and support the officers and their families over the public. Too often, one thinks that our response must be to the victims of a situation that the police or fire are called to. We're there to serve the first responders first. In corrections, there are a number of issues, and we've given you a slide here of questions that you should ask about Seventh-day Adventists being involved in ministering to inmates in a jail or prison, or having a jail band make regular visits. Look at those, answer them honestly, and deal with that aspect of ministry. There's another area that seldom is addressed, and if you happen to live within commuting distance of a major airport or seaport, you want to ask, what about a chaplaincy to that institution? Are these facilities government or privately owned and managed? How many people work in those places? Remember, I'm talking about 20,000 in the airport that I serve at. Is there a place designated for worker gatherings? Is leadership open to establishing a chapel for all faiths to use? Many airports have chapels, but often they're just barely more than a large closet for only 2 or 3 people to come in and meditate or pray. We're fortunate at our airport to have a place where you could seat 35 or 40 people. One of the amazing things about the airport chapels is that it is open for multi-faith use. So we have a place where Buddhists can come and pray at designated times, where Muslims have their prayer services, where Catholic Mass is conducted, and where Protestant and other Christian services are given. Literature for all these faith groups is available. Some people are amazed at that. We have many international visitors stop by and can't believe that one chapel can be available to people of so many different faiths. In their country, there would be one chapel after another for each of the different faiths. They like that idea, and they're glad for it. And so what kind of standards would be required for a clergy person to serve as a chaplain in a transportation type institution? And who provides that kind of leadership? Who's their primary focus? The crews who run the ships or boats or the planes? Or the workers who load them? Or the travelers, the passengers themselves? What access would the chaplains have to the work areas? And then would parking be provided for those chaplains who are serving? There's another area that is often overlooked, and that is the workplace in the community. Do you feel comfortable in secular work environments? Maybe you've had experience in secular jobs. What's your feeling about business corporations? Are they just big money looking for a profit? Are they antagonistic? Or are they really providing a service in your community? Do you have any kind of work experience for which a company would be interested in having a chaplain? What's your attitude toward labor unions? Would you be willing to cross a union strike picket line? Have you ever made a pastoral visit on a business executive, a manager, maybe of one of where your parishioner worked in the church? Have you ever visited your parishioners at their work site? And can you feel comfortable speaking about spiritual themes while maybe machinery is running in the background? When I retired from the military as a chaplain, I was offered by a very large corporation to become their corporate chaplain. The figures of $175,000 starting salary a year was very tempting, but that's not the reason that you go on to chaplaincy. And I really had some agenda and issues that I wanted to accomplish with Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries. Corporations today are looking for clergy leadership for several reasons. One, there's addictions among employees in the workplace, so they're looking for people to help there. Marriage and family issues. You just think what a divorce does to efficiency among employees. Violence in the workplace is a common occurrence, too common occurrence today, where a disgruntled employee comes back and starts to shoot up the place, and it doesn't matter who gets in the way. And then the issue of suicide prevention, the loss of experience and skills that occurs when that happens. So corporate business is waking up to the reality that many people are spending more time on the job at work and with people their peers that they work with than they are at home with family even. And the importance of obtaining spiritual guidance on the job, so to speak. You might be surprised at who would be open to having you come in as a community chaplain volunteer, or maybe even on a small stipend or part-time pay. We've mentioned something about labor and dealing with employee issues, but there's a bigger issue than worker rights, and that we've already mentioned, the forced slave labor or sex trafficking that exists in the world. Be alert to its signs and report to the authorities when you come across it. The physical abuse, the scars, chronic back pain, amputations, the confinement and isolation, the fact that a person must be escorted or restricted in their movements to even go from where they are lodging to the work site and back. The fact that they may have no legal documents. We've encountered some people whose passports had been taken from them. They couldn't leave the country here in the U.S. until they fulfilled certain labor requirements. Involuntary underage labor. You get seeing young people who look a little young. They should be in school rather than on a job site. And then this idea of debt bondage, where the earnings never match their quote, cost of living that is being provided them. There's a National Human Trafficking Resource Center. We've provided that and a hotline. Look at those things. What are some other possibilities for serving in the community? Well, there are legislatures. You can be a pastor to elected officials. Now, Barry Black is a typical example. He's paid as the Senate chaplain there in the U.S. Congress. But did you know most sports teams, particularly professional athletic events like the Olympics and professional sports teams, often have chaplains that deal with the emotions and the illnesses and injuries and deaths that occur on the teams? Oh, you can look at the list. Surprisingly, back in 2012, we had requests for Adventists who were serving at political conventions as a chaplain. We had to caution them to be very careful about public statements and also about being more than just a clergyman to all people and all sides. It's very interesting. You can look at some of the notes we put down about getting involved in these kind of things. Well, there's a couple of questions I've closed this section with. Scenarios, what would you do if your conference president calls you in and says, what are you wanting to get involved in the community? What are you trying to do? Leave the ministry to become a chaplain? Well, you can think of a number of scenarios and look at that. Chaplains are relational experts. We are the people who ought to be able to give guidance to leaders and members, to officials and to citizens about relational values, about resolving and guiding relationships, and upholding the positive and the good in this area. So I want to spend a few moments here talking about relationships. Again, we do it from the perspective of the whole person. We do it from the perspective of truth. And we've defined that here in some slides. Let's move on very quickly to chaplain intervention. We have also mentioned where in cases of death, you go, you make contact, you be present. When there is grief, post-traumatic stress disorder, moral injury, marriage and family domestic violence, and job-related issues, these are times to get involved. We've mentioned it earlier, but confidentiality is an absolute must for any chaplain, even community chaplains. Communication between a parishioner, a client, and a chaplain for religious purposes is legally considered privileged information in most cases. And the privilege belongs to the person sharing the information, who is doing the communicating to somebody that they believe is a chaplain or a clergy person, not the chaplain. The chaplain has the responsibility and the legal obligation to keep it in confidence. There are 3 situations where that may not hold. 1, threat of suicide by the communicator. You obviously want to keep them alive. An imminent threat of death or bodily harm to someone or yourself as a chaplain. And child abuse. There are various public laws about reporting that issue. So the information given to a chaplain for support and processing some kind of administrative action, that is not considered privileged information because it's got to be sent to higher authority in order for the action to occur. You may have remembered the story in 2 Samuel 11 and 12 about King David's fall with Bathsheba. Ethical violations are the byproduct of success rather than caused by competitive pressures. There are 4 contributing factors: complacency and the loss of vision or focus, privileged access to information, people, or objects, unconstrained control, where the opposition is limited and where accountability is minimal. And then the perceived ability to manipulate the outcome. You remember David went to lengths to try to make it appear that Uriah had gone and spent the night with his wife. We need to establish boundaries and gladly live within them, because fences on the edge of a cliff or a deep pit protect better than rescue efforts and ambulances at the bottom. You know the story of Samson, and you can see it here on the slide that I provided. And so we look at some issues that we need to understand when we're dealing in a world of sometimes mixed up values. Problems that clergy are confronted with and sometimes involved with. The dirty laundry of Sam. What is Sam? It is sex, abuse, and money. Nearly 10% of Adventist clergy over the years experience a betrayal of trust and are harmful to their careers, to their families, even to the church, as well as themselves. We all know better, so why does it happen? Repeatedly and repeatedly. You know Maslow's pyramid of needs. We've gone over that. We know about temptation, James chapter 1, verses 13 to 15, that it arises from within in an attempt illicitly or inadvertently or wrongly to satisfy human need. We need to be careful in how we handle any public monies that we are entrusted with, particularly church monies if you're involved with the pastorate. But more importantly, there is the issue of abuse that occurs. All aspects of life can become abusive, where power, authority, and influence as spiritual leaders that we often hold, we can do and be abusive in our own intemperance toward ourselves by doing good and working to the neglect of holy relationships such as family and spouse. We can be abusive with physical habits, whether we're obsessive compulsive or we're excessive in our eating or even exercise. But worse is relational abuse to children, to spouses, and to subordinates, to employees, those who work with or for us. What is the appropriate pastoral response? What is a chaplain response when you come across child or spousal abuse? It is always unacceptable. Physical harming, shaking, shoving, slapping, striking, all of those things are demeaning and physically harmful. Emotionally putting down people is just as bad. Unchecked abuse progresses eventually to death, either physically or emotionally, unless intervention and separation occurs. So in cases of domestic violence, whether it's with a child or a spouse, here's 3 things that you as a community chaplain, as a pastor, period, should do. 1, record the facts. Be objective and be honest, but record the facts. 2nd, report the incident, not just to the church, but to civil authorities promptly. They may or may not take the desired action or deem it worthy of taking action, but you should report. And 3rd, you refer the victim for professional help, whether it's medical or psychological. And then the perpetrator also should get professional therapy. You do not encourage reconciliation. You separate the victim from the danger until there is proof by those who are professional that there is a change of heart that leads to a change in behavior and thinking. There is a biblical principle here that sometimes we as Seventh-day Adventists don't emphasize enough. We're very keen on non-combatancy for the police and for the soldier in times of war. But the underlying biblical principle from the book of Genesis where Abraham rescues Lot is this: Christians have a moral responsibility, nay, an obligation to protect and defend the innocent and the weaker, those that are helpless. We live in a world of sexual deviancy. If you haven't seen it, I strongly encourage you. It's supposedly not real incidents. Look at SVU on television, a series that ran some years ago, and you will see the deprivation, the degradation of humankind. And we don't want to focus on that stuff, but there are many perversions out there. It's offensive to God because it corrupts and defiles the divine gift entrusted by God to humans for a holy purpose and for their well-being. We talk a little bit about sexual attraction, and we deal with that, and I even have a handout on this subject as well. How it is possible for, even within the church, between committed Christian people to get involved physically in an affair. And then there is sex in the forbidden zone. Even clergy have evil tendencies to abuse power and betray trust that people voluntarily place in them, especially when they are vulnerable and hurting. Past victimization contributes to present vulnerability. And culture has taught women that they have little to offer other than their sexuality. For a positive relationship, for recognition, for understanding, some comply and will engage in sex from psychological coercion. And so we could look at this subject in detail, but we've provided you some information and some things to consider and some resources for you to explore a little further. This is an important subject for you because you will be entrusted by people who are hurting, and if you are taking advantage of those situations to fulfill your own needs, you of all people should not be in chaplaincy. We are there as relational experts, and we have to instill self-boundaries as chaplains before we talk about boundaries for others. There's another slide here that deals with prevention, talking about maintaining professionalism and those factors that support that. Understanding your own preferences, tendencies, and feelings, but yet being aware that the heart is deceitful above all things. We're to guard well the avenues, the windows of the soul, our six senses. And then, above all, as men, make a covenant to cherish the wife of your youth. Job 31, verse 1, Proverbs 5, Malachi 2, Matthew 5, all talk about those things. Being like Joseph, living every day accountable to God, your spouse, and yourself. It's important as chaplains that we understand ethics, doing the right thing for the right reasons because it is right to do, even in secret when others aren't watching, when it's not going to get you publicity. Here's some advice for public servants. Care for those in need. Exercise integrity in fulfilling your duties and writing reports. Don't use your position for personal advantage. Be loyal to the organization and guard the reputation of superiors. And be willing to sacrifice for the greater good. I showed you the badge. We have the black stripe on it now because of deaths of officers. I rarely display this. I usually just show my ID. I would never think of taking this out in a business and saying, I'm with the police department. Do we get any discounts? That would be absolute a violation of the trust that that badge represents. Or I wouldn't show it. Oh, I'm sorry, officer. Did I mention that I was a police chaplain when you pulled me over for a traffic violation? Never use your position or your status as a community chaplain for any personal advantage. Just avoid the appearance of evil and choose the best of the better. Well, I like the quote from Steps to Christ, page 70. A life in Christ is a life of restfulness. And he goes on to say, your hope is not in yourself, it is in Christ, your weakness united to his strength, your ignorance to his wisdom, your frailty to his enduring might. You're going to encounter so many different situations where you're going to need divine wisdom and the gift of the Spirit's discernment to know the appropriate response that will enhance and build relationships rather than negate or harm them. Christ in his self-denial, in his humiliation, Christ in his purity and holiness, in his matchless love. This is the subject for your soul's contemplation, because it is by loving him, copying him, depending wholly upon him, that you are to be transformed into his likeness. Wow. Look, we don't have many models. We don't have a lot of examples for community chaplaincies. We're learning as we go. You cannot fail, though, if you adhere to some of these principles. Oh, you may make a lot of mistakes. I do many times. But we learn from those, and when you're honest with people, they're also quite forgiving. The reason for all relationships is based on trust and on trusting. It's the glue that holds relationships together. Trust based on integrity. We're never so vulnerable than when we trust someone, but paradoxically, if we cannot trust, neither can we find love and joy. And the best proof of love is trust. But I still like President Reagan, Ronald Reagan, who years ago said in the midst of the Cold War, trust but verify. Because the key is to get to know people and trust them to be who they are. We trust people to be who we are and want them to be. And when they are not, we cry. Stephen Covey spent a lot of time working on trust, and he developed a course that you can find online, The Speed of Trust. I urge you to look at some of these resources and study them in greater detail. Character. We talked about that in the past, doing the right thing when nobody is looking. Well, you may have some comments. We could tell stories and have a lot of fun here talking about some of the things we've experienced, but you're going to have those too. You've got to just get out and start doing and being. Take some of this material, build on it, explore it, put it into work and into application, and you'll be part of a chaplaincy before long. So, chaplain does do intervention. By intervention, find new ways to express and implement the Adventist advantage, because I believe our beliefs are biblically consistent. We have a tremendous Christological focus and a practical, holistic view of human nature, and we offer hope in the midst of prophetic understanding, even when it looks like the whole world is in chaos and is changing. I've given a little picture here of the human being body, mind, and spirit all overlapping, and it is where God's creative power instills that breath of life and makes us into a whole being. You know, Genesis 2, verse 7, God formed man from earth's elements. He breathed into man the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Whole person. That is one of our mantras as a church, that we deal with the whole person. Maslow gave his pyramid. I like our whole person concept better. You should also be aware of the awareness wheel. where we sense, interpret, feel, have intentions, and that produces actions. But impression without expression often leads to depression. And so we want to be careful about these kind of things, and this is why, again, we have community chaplains who intervene when there is awareness of trauma and tragedy going on, particularly with stress. Stress comes in two forms. It can be distress, negative, or a distress, which is positive. For instance, all the stress associated with a wedding. We've given you some charts here about stress injury and the results of intense or prolonged stress. You can look at those in detail. They're spelled out, but just know bad things happen to good people. There's even a continuum model of stress. It's broken into 4 areas. The green of ready. People are ready for stress. They're reacting to it. And they are injured by too much stress and actually become dysfunctional with what is colored red. You as a chaplain can probably be very helpful in that reactive and injured area. You need a real professional to help someone who's become dysfunctional due to stress. So how can you help continuously? Well, by checking and coordinating. There's 2 phases when you're dealing with people that are damaged by stress. Let's say you're dealing here with victims of a tsunami or a terrible storm in your area, or a tragedy from a shooting or a guerrilla attack on a village. Let's suppose, what is the primary concern that you want to do? Get people cover. Get them to safety as soon as possible. That's the first thing. And you don't want yourself shot, injured, killed in that process. You take particular care to survive as well. And secondly, you want to help them take a few deep breaths to be calm, relax, and help to refocus what they've just experienced in a little different way. That's the primary care you want to give, but there is some secondary aid as well that is necessary. Connecting them by getting support from others as needed. And then helping them restore effectiveness with just the basic necessities of life. Getting food, feeding themselves or preparing food, water, being shelter, taking care of children, etc. And then restoring confidence and self-esteem and hope. Those are secondary but important and necessary aid that you give to people. There's actually what is called the 7 C's of stress first aid model. We could go through those at some length. Again, you can go online, you can find these kind of things. Think stress first aid, think emotional first aid. They're all going to give basically the same steps. Whether it's put in a little different format by a different author, it all comes out to about the same. And I just want you to be aware of some of these things and see some of these models. And you can, as I said, type in stress first aid and you will have a great amount of resources available to you. I have also compared Christian counseling with what is secular. I have a master's in counseling and done some marriage and family training as well. And there are distinct differences, and I have compared those for you here in a slide that would be worth for you to go down and be aware of. As a chaplain, you will be called on to do some counseling. Christ's methods were basically rediscovered by the guru Carl Rogers of counseling. Be accepting. Practice unconditional positive regard. Listen attentively and even reflect, mirror conversation so that you understand what you're being told. And then give genuine, honest support. Who owns the problem? Who's got the monkey on their back? Do you want to assume responsibility for giving this person advice and saying, you ought to do this? Be very careful of falling into that trap. Counseling has a number of stages that are progressive, and ideally, if you understand that process, it will be very helpful to you, and I've listed these here for you as well. I'm not wanting here to teach a course on counseling, but I'm wanting to give you some outlines where you can delve deeper into this easily from your library or from online or from your church writings as well. There is a process to counseling. And it's interesting as I have studied how we win converts to become disciples to Jesus, the counseling process actually parallels making a disciple of Christ. You can look at that. It's here laid out for you, and I hope it will be helpful to you. As a chaplain, you should be aware situationally of what's going on, particularly when you're dealing with another individual. Because what you're told, the presenting problem, is usually not the real issue. It's the person's test balloon to check you out as a chaplain. Remember, who owns the problem? Are you willing to accept their problem? Watch for congruency. Stay focused on the client's issue, not on your agenda. And our agenda too often tends to be, we can fix it for you if you just do what I suggest. Beware of that question. What do you think, chaplain, I should do? Whose choice really is it? And are you willing to assume responsibility for the outcome and your client when you tell them what to do? Well, look to see what is not seen in that proverbial iceberg picture, which is really perceptions. Listen carefully to perceptions and help the individual that is asking you to help them see them from a different perspective. I like to think like a juggler. You're tossing up different balls and you're looking at it from different angles to help that individual see their problem from a different perspective. Because perceptions are interpreted ideas about oneself, about relationships, about life, the world, about God. And they're formed very early in childhood from messages that often stick with us into adulthood, and they can be very limiting. I still am haunted by an academy principal that told me, "Counsel, you'll never be a doctor. First of all, you're too poor, and secondly, you're too stupid." Well, I became a minister and said, perceptions are real. They're what is considered truth in the holder's mind, but they may not be reality, and generally are only partially true. They're often subjective, and they're viewed as a either dark cloud of negativity or rosy tinted, rather than objectively perceived. I've given you a slide here that describes the triangular trap, and you might want to look at that and see how that applies in your relationships that you might be dealing with. Again, we've stressed confidentiality, and we'll not go over that again, or the pastoral response when we have domestic violence. Here is something where you need to get help. Don't try to deal with drunk or people who are high on drugs. You can't counsel them. You really can't help them spiritually. That's where the police and other people come in. You don't try to solve those problems. Irrational anger, threatening behavior. You might become a victim, and that's not your role to resolve those kind of things. Talk about committing suicide. You stay with that person until they get help. Seizures. I once had in a staff meeting on a military installation, the Red Cross representative sitting next to me developed a grand mal epilepsy seizure. I was shocked at what went on in the room. People got up from their chairs at the big table and crowded to the far wall. They did not know how to deal with this. Domestic violence, seductive sexual behaviors, requests for money or other handouts. We have a lot of homeless people that are at the airport because in the terminal, they've got public restrooms, it's insecure, they're not going through secure area yet, and so sometimes they even sleep there. And they're really tolerated so long as they're not panhandling and bothering people requesting for money. When you get requests for cash and other handouts, you really can't help everyone. Whenever you lose your objectivity and become emotionally involved with another person's issue or their personhood, it's time to, as we've heard, refer. You back out and get some other help because you're not the Messiah who can solve everyone's problems. So how do you do referrals? What are we talking about? In my office, I keep a notebook of local helping agencies. And we try to get acquainted with the leaders of these various agencies, the homeless shelters, the funeral directors, some of the other, the sheriff. We have a police department, but there is the sheriff and his deputies, who is the jailer, and some of the magistrates that we deal with. We try to get acquainted with people who would be folks that we would refer situations to. Be kindly honest with those individuals you're trying to help but cannot, and share how they might benefit from other help, and then obtain that person's consent to make a referral. Arrange the appointment and introduce the person to the new professional, and then share your general assessment with that new professional. You might say, we have been discussing a problem that they have, and you could give the general nature of it, but you would not give details that might violate confidentiality that you've been told. Whatever you do, you don't leave a person who is threatening suicide alone. You stay with them until some form of help is given to them and they're getting care. You continue then the pastoral and spiritual care without interfering in the referred relationship. I've included a section here on ministry to the grieving. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because there's several areas that we could look at: bereavement, grief, and mourning. They all have different meanings and carry different connotations of how you would respond as a chaplain. Grief is experienced by all humanity since creation. About 1% of the Earth's population dies annually. This is never what God intended. And I think He is heartbroken by the losses of His sons and daughters when death occurs between man, and it affects also God. It breaks that relationship. Death is separation. And so grieving is natural, and it follows. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross some years ago had set out 5 stages of grief. Those have been interpreted in different ways and added to. And then there are other stages that are identified by other experts. I've given you some of that for you to review here in the slides that you'll get. There's anticipatory grief, ministry to those who are dying and who know that they are dying. In some sense, we all are, and we should prepare for that appointment. There is a pastoral ministry that we should be involved in. Go visit, because the ministry of presence is the priority. You sense the mourner's needs and you focus on meeting those. You ask yourself, what would I like done if it were me in these circumstances? And yet be aware of your own helplessness to solve and fix a lot of this. Be prepared for any kind of emotional response. I once sat with a lady in the hospital for over 2 hours because she did not want to go in and identify the body of her husband. Finally, after 2 hours of visiting and listening to her, she said, I think I'm ready now, Chaplain. So we got up and we went into the emergency room, and he was out there on the table. And she saw him. It happened to be Christmas Eve. And when she saw him, she went up to him and literally started pounding on his chest and screamed out and then sobbed out, why have you done this to me on Christmas? Be prepared for all kinds of emotional response to death on the part of family members. Some collapse in almost a fetal position on the floor when they're told. Others almost seem to take it with denial. I happened to be riding with an officer one morning, and we got a notice of a death in a home nearby. And I said to the dispatcher, I said, look, communications, you don't need to bother the on-call chaplain. I'm right here riding with one of the officers. I'll go and take care of this. And so we went and stopped, and a gentleman was just at the door as we went up to the door, and he saw me as the chaplain, and he said, Chaplain, I'm late for work. Don't worry about my brother, he's dead in there. I'll see you later, goodbye. And he walked to his car and left. That was the extent of your ministry. You don't know what kind of response you might have. So you can accompany family or survivors to identify bodies. We don't like to use the term bodies or even deceased. We like to call them rather by name, if you know it. But be prepared personally to see the reality of death. You can facilitate family members talking. Listen for feelings. You're not there, though, to argue or judge emotions. You're there to help stimulate positive memories. I've been asked a number of times to give to a family member the word that someone in their family has died. Make sure that the person you're talking to is indeed the relative or the primary person who should get that information, so that you don't mistakenly blurt out something like that to a neighbor or to a friend or to somebody else and upset them. You must be accurate in dealing with this. And there's whole procedures about how you do that. In fact, I teach it out there at the academy for the police. Here's some things you may not want to do. You don't tell mourners, be strong now and stop crying. Or worse, I know how you feel. I understand what it's like. Why, when my father, or what? Everything will be all right. It's probably for the best. They won't be suffering now. Why, you've been blessed to have her or him so long. Or this one, how about a guilt trip? This wouldn't have happened if. Wow, those are things you don't want to do. I went to one funeral here a while back, and the clergyman conducting it said to us at the graveside, "Now I want everybody to look up. I want you to raise your hands up, and I want you to wave goodbye, because right now the soul is on its way to heaven." Well, this is not the time to correct other people's theology or beliefs. I had to bite my tongue on that one, I got to tell you. But we're not here to defend God or your doctrinal beliefs about death. And don't make the assumption that you'll be the person asked to conduct the funeral. You may not be. On several occasions I have been. Didn't know the people, never met them before until the night we went in to give the bad news. And don't ignore children of the deceased. Well, we could go on and on. Recovery, of course, is part of ministering to the grief and through the mourning, those who mourn. And I think we can help our members and those who we are dealing with, in our various first responders even, to face death and to help those who are facing death or in dealing with death. And as a church, we also can do that. Well, I want to deal in my last segment with this topic on the chaplain, with the equipment and ID that you should have. Every agency you serve should provide you with photo identification, some kind of photo ID for security and internal use, for access to buildings, to resources, and secure areas. And the ID should be attached to a carrier of some kind for display while you are on duty or in a secure area in particular. A blouse, a cap, a jacket, shirt should clearly and visibly display the word chaplain. You are not a fireman. You are not a police officer. You are a chaplain. And there is a difference. If you use a personal vehicle for official business, a sign should be displayed in the front or the rear window that reads, "Chaplain on duty for official business." And again, I mentioned never misuse that ID of any kind as a badge of authority to coerce or threaten someone, for bargaining for discounts, for expecting failures or leniency in a situation. And except when you're performing official duties, avoid showing that ID or wearing any uniforms that suggest authority or status. Here's a suggestion. Obtain agency approval for chaplains to possess and use business cards that have an official emblem or logo on it and with personal contact information on it. Be very wise about that. When you're making your rounds or you're on duty as a chaplain, I suggest that you carry a few items for personal care, a mobile telephone with current list of contacts, pen, pencil, and paper for writing notes, just small. A small pocket flashlight or torch, as it's sometimes called in other countries. Some business cards, a little bottle of rubbing alcohol, 2 or 3 ounces in a small container for cleaning your hands. You may encounter situations where you get a little dirty. You're out on the road or you're riding with an officer and you're grabbing lunch as you can. There's always not available a restroom where you can go wash. So you carry a little hand sanitizer or some rubbing alcohol to clean up. Any personal medications that you need. You should also carry on duty or while you're making contacts, a pocket Bible or New Testament with Psalms. Some small tracts pertinent to the need of the persons. Care notes are excellent. I know they're published by a Catholic press, but they are super and they cover a wide range of emergency situations or healthcare needs. And they are excellently written for people of all faiths. Small tracts pertinent to the need of persons visited. I like to leave something with everyone I visit, Bible verse cards that I showed here earlier, or maybe even the thing called a cross in my pocket. Any little thing that can help remind people of you and your chaplaincy or of something greater in their lives. Jesus said, "Be ye therefore ready." The need for chaplain services rarely is programmed, and it comes unexpectedly at all hours. We get call-outs from communications and from headquarters that require immediate response, and warning orders are rarely given. The call-outs have sometimes lasted an hour. I've been able to walk to a neighbor's home, but usually you're driving an hour, because it could be anywhere in the county, and you're trying to find addresses at night. Yes, you have a GPS or your phone maps, but those call-outs can last several hours up to several days. You don't know. Meals, water, and a place to sleep are sometimes provided. When we're out on the road, we stop. And sometimes we have to carry our lunch with us. Other times we go in to a restaurant, but when we do, we've had our meal interrupted, so you always ask for carry-out. You may be able to sit down at a table in the restaurant, but you've got to be ready to close that thing up and head out the door. And while weather may be pleasant at the beginning of duty, be prepared for changes. It can turn cooler, and it can rain or snow. Be ready. And so in my go bag, I carry a raincoat and extra hat and gloves. And then it's important you travel safely when you report to your place of duty. You're no good to anybody if you're sick, injured, or dead. I referred to a go bag. What am I talking about? I said a duffel, a backpack, a briefcase type of thing should be prepared and kept securely in a handy place or in your vehicle. Here's some items I keep in my personal go bag. A tactical type flashlight, one that is very bright. A raincoat or hat and cold weather items, particularly in the temperate climates where you might need gloves. A change of socks and underwear if you're out for extended periods of time, even of small personal size toiletries. A supply of business cards. A Bible and supply of literature. And then a cell phone or flash drive with rosters of agency leaders and chaplains who are the other chaplains on the team. Contact information for helping agencies, some resources, some manuals, devotionals on this flash drive. And if electronic means are unavailable, have this data on paper format. I keep it in plastic folders so it doesn't get deteriorated by weather. And even then I find that in hot weather they stick together and sometimes the copy is destroyed. A bottle of water, or at least a drinking cup handy. You might want a couple small high energy snack foods that will stay edible in secure wrapping. And then a knife and some eating utensils. Whatever you might need that when you're away from home or your resources, you should have prepared in a go bag for possible extended stay and duty. I've listed here in the back of this section, this topic, some books that I believe are essential reading for you as a chaplain with their various ISBN numbers and authors. And then have given you the addresses, phone numbers, and websites of various organizations that are important for you to know as a community chaplain. And lastly, some other publications like Care Notes, NOVAD resources, and so forth. And where also I have done some previous work with Adventist learning community, a course on community chaplains. These might be additional resources for you to consider.